Welcome to Crime Case Confidential, where we dive into the darkest corners of human nature to uncover the truth behind some of the most shocking crimes. Today, we're taking you to the quiet, upper-middle-class suburb of Fort Myers, Florida. But beneath the surface of this peaceful community, a sinister plot was brewing, one that would end in murder. This is the story of how a husband's twisted obsession led him to poison his wife, all in a desperate attempt to marry her daughter, Rachel. Caroline Davis was a 48-year-old woman who lived with her family in Fort Myers, Florida. She was well known in the community for her friendly demeanor, kind heart, and constant willingness to help others. Fort Myers, a sunny city nestled along the Gulf Coast, was the perfect setting for Caroline's happy life, or so it seemed. The city had a reputation for its picturesque beaches, laid-back atmosphere, and thriving local art scene. But it also had a tight-knit community where people knew their neighbors well. Caroline's warmth and generosity made her a pillar in the local community. She often organized neighborhood events, including holiday potlucks, church fundraisers, and community service initiatives. Her house, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was always filled with the smells of home-cooked meals and baked goods, and it was the go-to spot for family gatherings. Her home was a welcoming place with bright rooms and personal touches everywhere. Handmade quilts, family photos, and vintage furniture passed down from generations. Caroline had a passion for cooking and was famous for her chocolate chip cookies, which she would often bake for local events or to cheer up friends. In the kitchen, which served as the heart of the home, Caroline spent hours creating dishes that reflected her love for her family and her joy in nurturing those around her. Caroline was married to Andrew Davis, a man 16 years younger than her. Despite the significant age gap, the couple had seemed happy at first. Andrew, at 32, worked as a financial consultant in Naples, Florida, a nearby city known for its upscale lifestyle and luxury resorts. His job kept him busy, but Andrew and Caroline still made time for each other. The couple had been married for 5 years, and from the outside, everything seemed picture perfect. They lived with Caroline's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Rachel Lewis. Rachel was a bright, motivated college student studying pre-med, with dreams of becoming a doctor. She attended Florida Gulf Coast University and had earned a scholarship because of her academic achievements. Rachel was close to her mother, and Caroline was incredibly proud of her daughter's ambitions. Rachel had always admired her mother, seeing her as a role model. Growing up, Caroline had been a single parent after Rachel's father passed away when she was young, and this tragic loss had strengthened the bond between mother and daughter. Together, they had navigated life's ups and downs, with Caroline always providing guidance and love. As a family, the three seemed stable, but things were far more complicated behind closed doors. Caroline had been planning a family vacation to Orlando for weeks. She was excited about the trip, constantly talking about what rides they would go on and what restaurants they would try. She had already bought new summer clothes for the trip and had a suitcase filled with sunscreen, sandals, and the essentials for their getaway. Caroline loved these trips. Spending time with her family was what brought her the most joy. But that joy was short-lived. On the morning of April 17, 2019, Caroline's life came to a tragic end. That morning, Fort Myers was just waking up, the sky overcast, with the promise of rain later in the day. At around 8:30 a.m., Rachel Lewis came downstairs to the kitchen and immediately sensed something was wrong. The kitchen was quiet, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. Her mother, Caroline, was lying on the floor, completely unresponsive. Next to her, a can of Diet Pepsi was spilled, the soda slowly trickling into the cracks between the tiles. Rachel's heart sank. She rushed to her mother's side, shaking her gently, calling out her name. But there was no response. Caroline's skin was cold to the touch, and Rachel's mind raced with fear. Panicked, Rachel grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she begged the operator to send help. "Please, my mom. She's not breathing. I think she's dead," Rachel cried, her hands shaking so much that she could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher's calm voice tried to reassure her, but Rachel was too overcome with panic to listen. The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Rachel pacing back and forth in the living room, tears streaming down her face. She could hardly process what was happening. Her mother had been fine the day before, laughing, joking, and talking about their upcoming trip. Now, she was gone. The house was quiet, except for the beeping of medical equipment and the murmurs of the paramedics as they assessed the situation. They rushed to Caroline's side, but it was too late. She had passed away, and there was nothing more they could do. Caroline was declared dead at the scene. Rachel could barely comprehend the situation, standing in stunned silence, replaying the morning's events over and over in her head. It was surreal. She had just found her mother lying there, a can of her favorite soda beside her, and now she was gone. As the paramedics prepared to leave, Rachel called her stepfather, Andrew Davis, who was at work at the time. His reaction was extreme. He began wailing loudly over the phone, his voice so full of anguish that it startled Rachel. Andrew told her he would leave work immediately and be home as soon as possible. His grief seemed almost performative, a show of overwhelming emotion that bordered on hysteria. But Rachel, in her own shock, didn't notice the strangeness of his behavior. The police arrived shortly after the paramedics. Detective Megan Flores, an experienced investigator with the Fort Myers Police Department, was assigned to lead the case. Flores was known for her thorough, no-nonsense approach, and she had been with the department for over 15 years, handling a wide range of cases, from burglaries to homicides. She had an eye for details that others might overlook, and her intuition often led her to ask the right questions. The first thing Flores noticed was how calm the scene appeared. The house was neat, the furniture undisturbed, and there were no obvious signs of a struggle. Caroline's body was lying next to a half-empty can of Diet Pepsi. The can was still relatively full, but a small amount of the soda had spilled on the floor, slowly drying in the Florida heat. Something about the scene struck Flores as odd. There were no immediate signs of foul play, no forced entry, no broken glass, no blood. But the sight of Caroline's lifeless body, along with the can of Diet Pepsi beside her, seemed off. Detective Flores and her team immediately began securing the crime scene. Yellow tape was put up around the perimeter of the house, and officers were stationed at the entrance to keep the neighbors and onlookers at a distance. Inside, Flores instructed her team to start taking photographs and documenting everything, every angle, every piece of evidence. The team collected samples from the floor and countertops, taking care to gather as much forensic evidence as possible. Caroline's purse was still on the kitchen counter, untouched, and the back door was locked from the inside, ruling out the possibility of a break-in. The paramedics had initially suggested that Caroline might have suffered a heart attack, but Flores wasn't ready to settle on that explanation. There was something about the scene that made her uneasy. Why was the can of Diet Pepsi only partially empty? Why had Caroline collapsed so suddenly? Flores knew she needed to dig deeper. An autopsy was ordered to determine the exact cause of death, and the can of Diet Pepsi was taken to the lab for testing. Flores also instructed her team to carefully examine Caroline's phone, looking for any calls, messages, or social media activity that might offer clues as to what had happened in the hours leading up to her death. As the investigation began, the police turned their attention to Andrew Davis, Caroline's husband. Andrew had been at work when the incident occurred, and when he was interviewed by the police later that day, his behavior raised more questions than it answered. Andrew was 32, significantly younger than Caroline, and worked as a financial consultant in Naples. He had built a successful career and was known to be charming and ambitious. But as the detectives dug deeper into his life, they discovered a darker side. Andrew had met Caroline 6 years earlier at a networking event. Caroline, a widow at the time, had been drawn to his youthful energy and confident demeanor. Despite the age gap, they quickly fell in love and were married within a year. Andrew had become a stepfather to Rachel, and the three of them had seemed like a happy family. But in recent months, friends of the couple had noticed that Andrew was becoming increasingly distant from Caroline. He spent long hours at work, often traveling for business, and he and Caroline rarely spent time together anymore. During his first interview with Detective Flores, Andrew appeared calm, almost too calm. He expressed shock and sadness over his wife's death, but his emotions seemed strangely muted. He told the detectives that he had been at work when Caroline died and had rushed home as soon as Rachel called. When asked about his relationship with Caroline, Andrew described it as fine, though he admitted they had grown apart over the years. He insisted that he had nothing to do with her death, and that he couldn't imagine why anyone would want to harm her. But as the interview went on, Flores became increasingly suspicious. Andrew's answers were too vague, too rehearsed. He claimed to know little about Caroline's daily routine, even though they had been married for 5 years. He also mentioned that Caroline drank Diet Pepsi regularly, but when pressed about why there was a half-empty can next to her body, he seemed flustered and unable to provide a clear answer. Flores wasn't convinced by Andrew's story. Something didn't feel right. Could Andrew have had a motive for wanting Caroline out of the picture? As she continued to investigate, more unsettling information came to light. The detectives soon uncovered a shocking secret. Andrew had developed an unhealthy obsession with his stepdaughter, Rachel Lewis. This revelation changed the entire course of the investigation. If Andrew had been in love with Rachel, it could explain why he might want Caroline out of the way. But proving that Andrew had been involved in Caroline's death would require solid evidence. The police next turned their attention to Rachel. Rachel had always been an exemplary student, excelling academically and socially. She was dedicated to her studies and had a bright future ahead of her. Rachel had been close to her mother, and the loss was hitting her hard. When the police questioned her about her relationship with Andrew, she spoke highly of him, describing him as a good stepfather who had always supported her academic pursuits. She had no idea that Andrew harbored romantic feelings for her. The detectives continued to dig into Rachel's life, looking for any signs of tension or conflict within the household, but they found nothing to suggest that Rachel had been involved in her mother's death. Her alibi was solid. She had been studying for an upcoming exam when Caroline died, and her phone records backed up her story. However, the police couldn't ignore the possibility that Rachel had unknowingly played a role in Andrew's twisted plans. Could Andrew's obsession with her have driven him to murder Caroline? As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered more disturbing details about Andrew's secret life. The next person the police questioned was Jessica Parker, Caroline's closest friend. Jessica, 45, was a real estate agent and had known Caroline for over a decade. The two women had been inseparable, often spending evenings together at each other's homes, sharing stories about work and family. But what the police uncovered about Jessica shocked even those closest to Caroline. Jessica had been having an affair with Andrew for over a year. According to Jessica, the affair had started innocently enough. Andrew had confided in her about his troubles with Caroline, and their friendship had slowly turned into something more. Jessica admitted to feeling guilty about betraying her friend, but she had fallen in love with Andrew and couldn't bring herself to end the relationship. When the police interviewed Jessica, she was visibly nervous. She knew that her affair with Andrew put her under suspicion, but she insisted that she had nothing to do with Caroline's death. Jessica claimed that she had loved Caroline like a sister and had been devastated by her passing. However, she also revealed that Andrew had recently told her that he was in love with someone else, someone younger, and was planning to leave her. Jessica suspected that the other woman might have been Rachel. The detectives pressed Jessica for more details, but she maintained her innocence. She provided an alibi for the day of Caroline's death, claiming that she had been at a real estate showing in Naples, and her clients confirmed her story. While Jessica's affair with Andrew raised suspicions, there was no concrete evidence linking her to the crime. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the toxicology report came back from the lab. The report revealed that Caroline had been poisoned with cyanide, a rare and highly toxic substance. The poison had been mixed into her can of Diet Pepsi, and she had unknowingly consumed it shortly before her death. Cyanide poisoning causes rapid organ failure and death, and it was clear that Caroline's death had been a premeditated act of murder. With this new evidence, the detectives began to focus their investigation on Andrew. They re-interviewed him, this time pressing him on his knowledge of poisons and asking about his internet search history. It wasn't long before they uncovered damning evidence. Andrew had been researching cyanide for months before Caroline's death. He had searched for information on where to buy the poison, how to use it, and what its effects were on the human body. It became clear to the detectives that Andrew had carefully planned Caroline's murder. He had spiked her can of Diet Pepsi with cyanide, knowing that she drank a can every day after work. On the day of the murder, he had left for work as usual, leaving the poisoned soda behind for Caroline to consume. The poison worked quickly, causing her to collapse and die within minutes. Andrew had likely hoped that the cyanide would go undetected, and that Caroline's death would be attributed to natural causes, such as a heart attack. But the toxicology report exposed his plan. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the police arrested Andrew Davis and charged him with first-degree murder. His arrest sent shockwaves through the Fort Myers community. People who had once seen him as a devoted husband and successful businessman were now horrified to learn the truth, that he had killed his wife in cold blood, driven by a twisted obsession with his stepdaughter. The trial of Andrew Davis began in January 2020. The case attracted widespread media attention, with local news outlets covering every detail of the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with friends, family, and community members who wanted to see justice served for Caroline. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Perez, presented a strong case against Andrew. They laid out the evidence of his internet searches, the traces of cyanide found in Caroline's drink, and his unhealthy obsession with Rachel. Perez argued that Andrew had meticulously planned the murder, hoping to rid himself of Caroline so that he could pursue a relationship with his stepdaughter. Andrew's defense attorney, Victoria Thompson, tried to paint a different picture. She argued that Andrew was a man under immense stress and that his actions were not premeditated. She claimed that he had been struggling with his mental health and that the murder had been a moment of weakness, not a calculated plan. But the evidence against Andrew was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning with a guilty verdict. Andrew was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Caroline's family and friends, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but the pain of losing her would never fully heal. Rachel was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, now motherless and burdened with the knowledge that her stepfather had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She took a leave of absence from school to focus on her mental health and mourn the loss of her mother. As for Jessica Parker, the affair with Andrew tarnished her reputation in the community. Although she was not involved in the murder, the scandal of her relationship with him made it difficult for her to continue her life in Fort Myers. She eventually moved to another city, hoping to leave the past behind and start fresh. The murder of Caroline Davis was a tragic reminder of the dark secrets that can lurk behind even the most seemingly perfect lives. It left an indelible mark on the Fort Myers community, and those who knew Caroline would forever remember her as the kind, loving woman whose life was cut short by a man she had trusted.